Their talk about collaboration is just the perfect segue for Annie Murphy-Paul, who is an esteemed journalist and author. She writes the brilliant blog, which sort of tells you how brilliant she is, and she writes for time.com, right? Okay. And she is going to pull this all together and kind of help us understand what we've learned today and yesterday. So, Annie.
Thanks, Wendy. I want to dispel at the outset any idea that I am brilliant. I am lowering expectations here for my speech, okay? So, thank you all for sticking around to the end of this incredibly exciting and jam-packed meeting to hear what I have to say. You know, what we all saw here at the Sandbox Summit 2014 was pretty uniformly fascinating, I would say, whether it was Tinsley and Stephanie's approach to child-driven learning, or Jeff's adventures in transmedia, or John's promotion of world peace as imagined by fourth graders. Some of this may have lined up exactly with what you do. It may have given you some ideas and insights that you can apply first thing tomorrow morning. Maybe Scott's review of what age-appropriate means, or Mitchell's 4 guiding principles. Those are things that you can see applying right away. But given the variety of what was presented here over the last few days, from the sleight of hand of Apollo Robbins to the brain-computer interface demonstrated by Steve, a lot of what you heard and saw was likely in some measure removed from your own work. With that in mind, I want to talk today about how we build bridges between old ideas and new ideas, between concepts that are close to home intellectually and those that range farther afield. Because it's these bridges, these connections, that produce innovation. There's this popular notion out there that innovation comes kind of as a bolt out of the blue, as a radical departure from previous knowledge, when really most new ideas are extensions or twists or variations on what's come before. And the skill of generating innovations is largely the skill of putting old things together in a new way, or looking at familiar ideas from a new perspective, or using what we already know to understand something new. And I say skill because we don't have to leave these encounters up to chance. We don't have to wait for lightning to strike. We can right now hone our ability to deploy analogies. Analogies, comparing one entity to another apparently different entity, is one of the most powerful tools that humans have for understanding our world and for generating new knowledge. In their book, Mental Leaps, Analogy in Creative Thought, a really fantastic book that I recommend, cognitive scientists Keith Holyoake and Paul Thagard point out how many intellectual advances through the ages have been built on analogies. The 1st century Roman architect Vitruvius compared the sound of actors' voices in an amphitheater to the movement of water in a pool, the first of many thinkers to compare sound waves to water waves. The 17th century scientist William Gilbert compared the Earth to a magnet, advancing knowledge of the Earth's gravitational force. The 18th century chemist Antoine Lavoisier compared respiration to combustion, clarifying how breathing turns oxygen into carbon dioxide. Even the great 19th century biologist Charles Darwin built his theory of evolution on an analogy between artificial selection, the deliberate mating of animals by breeders, to the natural selection that goes on in the wild. And analogies are still frequently used by scientists working today, as University of Maryland professor Kevin Dunbar discovered when he observed firsthand scientists working in 4 microbiology labs. Dunbar found that the scientists use as many as 15 analogies in a single 1-hour laboratory meeting, and that the more successful labs used more analogies in discussing their work. And he also found that one of the 4 labs that was least successful almost never used analogies when they were discussing their work. So let's look more closely at what's happening conceptually when we make an analogy. The essential requirement for analogical thinking, Holyoake and Thagard write, is the ability to look at specific situations and pull out abstract patterns that may also be found in superficially different situations. That's important, so I'll say it again in a slightly different way. A useful analogy reveals the deep commonalities beneath the superficial differences. So we can think of analogies as having 2 parts, the base and the target. The base is the thing that you know something about. The target is the thing that's new. Analogies are created by elaborating the similarities and the differences between the base and the target. When we use an analogy, we take what we know about the base and we apply some of it to the target. Northwestern University psychologist Deirdre Gentner calls this process bootstrapping the mind, elevating ourselves into the realm of new knowledge, using the knowledge that we already have to pull ourselves up. So what does this allow us to do, this use of analogies? The scientists that Kevin Dunbar studied used analogies first and foremost to formulate hypotheses that they could then test. Their thought process went something like this. If we know that X does Y when Z, is it possible that A does Y when Z too? Let's find out. And that's how new knowledge, innovations, are generated. Psychologist and author Steven Pinker, who has composed many a memorable analogy himself, notes that carefully interpreted, analogies are not just alluring frames, but actual theories which make testable predictions and can prompt new discoveries. Dunbar scientists found analogies useful on another kind of occasion as well, using them as sense-making tools when they encountered anomalies or unexpected findings in their work. This was also the case for another group of scientists whose use of analogy became the subject of study, scientists working on the Mars rover mission. A team led by University of Pittsburgh professor Christian Shun analyzed transcripts of the discussions that the Mars rover scientists had as they actually worked on the mission, problem solving, dealing with things that came up. Shun and his colleagues found that the Mars rover scientists used analogies more frequently when their uncertainty spiked. The appearance in the transcript of words indicating uncertainty, such as maybe, I don't know, I don't understand, were often followed by an attempt to make an analogy, to compare the uncertain situation to a situation with which they were familiar. So at such moments, the scientists were employing analogies as a different sort of bridge, a conceptual bridge that would provide just enough room to move forward and keep searching for solutions. As Shun writes, scientists and engineers do not always seek to completely eliminate uncertainty, and indeed, sometimes it's not possible to do so, but often drive problem solving with the aim of converting it into approximate ranges sufficient to continue problem solving. And that's what making an analogy lets them do, continue problem solving until they reach the ultimate solution. So my focus today clearly is on innovation, but because the Sandbox Summit is also about children and learning, I want to take a moment here to point out that analogies are also a potent tool for learning. Research shows that even very young learners can benefit from simple analogies. Researchers Stella Wozniacki and Marlene Schomer, for example, found that children as young as 5 years old understood and remembered scientific concepts better when they were accompanied by analogies. Kindergartners who learned that communities of termites have members who act as leaders, workers, and guards understood and remembered those facts better when they were also told that termite societies are like kingdoms. So they knew about kingdoms from watching Disney movies or whatever. When they were able to make that analogy to what they were learning about these insects, they learned and remembered that material better. As they get older, children get more sophisticated in their use of analogies, but they still need help making the connection. In a study led by Northwestern University professor Brian Matlin, 4th and 5th graders were shown materials that made a visual analogy, comparing the layers of the earth to the layers of a peach, like this, the peel on the outside, the flesh of the fruit, the pit on the inside, and comparing that to the layers of the earth. Children who were shown pictures of the earth and the peach were better able to apply their knowledge than children who were shown only the peach. So it was actually placing the two side by side that really allowed the children to make the connection and cement that knowledge. Although the pupils who saw only the peach were presumably familiar with what the earth's layers look like, it helped the other group to have the two images side by side. And even adults often need a nudge to notice and make use of an analogy. Researcher Jeffrey Lowenstein of the University of Illinois found that business students for whom an analogy between two cases were pointed out were nearly 3 times more likely to incorporate the strategy from the case studies into their negotiations, this is all a classroom exercise, than were students who were given the same cases separately. All the participants got the same materials, but unless the students were explicitly prompted to make a connection between the two cases, the students didn't draw the parallel that was there to be made and did not apply it in a real-life situation. Such studies suggest that in order to maximize learning and creativity, we need to make a deliberate effort to use analogies ourselves and to encourage others to do so. So we've now seen that there are lots of good reasons to employ analogies. They provide us with new hypotheses to test. They can help us make sense of unanticipated results so that we can keep moving forward, and they can help us learn new information. So how do we go about generating a useful generative analogy? The first step, obviously, is choosing the base and the target. We should choose it carefully. The base and the target should be similar enough. That's the first thing to create a true bridge. If the target is too wildly different from the base, there won't be any productive similarities to draw. The similarities must be deep and not just superficial. Giovanni Gavetti, who's a Harvard Business School professor, has found that management teams are easily misled by an analogy with similarities on the surface, but differences at a deeper level. So we need to be looking for similarities that are deep and not just on the surface. At the same time, the base and the target have to be different enough to coax some revealing illumination from the differences. In a study led by researcher Diane Halpern of the University of Louisville, students who compared the movement of lymphatic fluid through the lymph system to the movement of blood through veins didn't get much from the comparison. The target and the base were too close, and the analogy didn't shed much light. But comparing the lymphatic system to the movement of water through a sponge, that was a bigger mental leap, and it produced more learning in the students that Halpern studied. To aid in finding just the right analogy, it helps to have a deep pool of potential targets. The Boston Strategy Group, which is a consulting firm, has actually created an online gallery of sources of analogical inspiration for its consultants and its clients to use. And we can all do this too, bookmarking or pinning websites that inspire connections, keeping a folder of ripped out articles or pictures from newspapers and magazines. A classroom or a workplace team could even create a shared repository of potential analogical targets. So that's the first step. Choose the target and the base carefully. The second step in using an analogy is to thoroughly draw out the similarities between base and target. Just posing the comparison, just kind of putting it out there isn't enough. We need to think carefully about how and why the base and target are alike. Third, we need to define what doesn't carry over from the base to the target, the places where the analogy breaks down. This is important because it's easy for us to assume inappropriate similarities between the two things that we're comparing. For example, education professor Rand Spiro of Michigan State University found that medical students and even doctors were sometimes misled by the common comparison of blood flowing through blood vessels to water flowing through pipes. The students and the physicians erred by attending to the similarities between blood vessels and pipes, but by failing to factor in the differences, that the flow in blood vessels is affected not only by the diameter of the blood vessel, which would be the case of the pipe, but also by the flexible contractions of the vessel and by the heart's beating. So there are all these places where the pipe blood vessel analogy breaks down, and we need to pay attention to that to really make the analogy work. And it's not that the medical students thought that blood vessels actually were rigid like pipes, it's that they focused on the similarities in the analogy and overlooked the differences. The fourth and final step in using an analogy is to draw conclusions from the analogy and then to move away from it. This can be hard to do. Harvard's Giovanni Gavetti notes that business students often become attached to the details in the business cases they study. And of course, case study teaching is itself an analogical approach. They get attached to those details rather than abstracting from them the more general patterns that the cases share. If any of you teach, I'm sure you've found this to be true of many students, that they get attached to the details of what they're learning rather than the bigger picture, the deeper structure. The idea here is to use the analogy as a bridge, and then once you've crossed the bridge, leave it behind. So as I wrap up this talk, I'd like you all to take a moment now to think of a particular project or challenge you face in your job. This familiar work would be your base. Now I want you to think of one particularly striking thing you heard or saw at the Sandbox Summit over the past few days. This is your target, the new and unfamiliar thing. So, and as we talked about, you want to choose something that's both similar enough and different enough from what you do to be useful. And now take a moment to draw out all the similarities between the two and all the differences, all the ways that they are not alike, the places where the analogy breaks down. So I'm not going to ask you to carry out that final step to draw conclusions and insights from the comparison, from the analogy, just now. I want to have planted a seed that may blossom later, a flower growing from the sandbox. Thank you very much.